Hello again, everybody. Welcome back. Today we are going to be looking at our second video for Content Area 4, Later Europe and the Americas, focusing more on the 20th century and continued look at a lot of the isms that are present. All right, so a little bit of background on art and also historical context. So all of the movements together in this 20th century period could be considered modernism. So it's one broad category for all of the different smaller ones. And basically the idea is all of these isms, what they have in common is this rejection of naturalism and of academicism. So think about before the academies had traditional subjects, traditional styles, and they kind of dictated what artists should do if they wanted to get their work into the salons. That was kind of a common idea for a long time. Also patrons, churches, royalty, aristocrats, they kind of led the way for artists. They were the ones who kind of told them what they wanted. Now, modernism kind of switches it around, and the artist becomes the ultimate person to make a lot of these decisions. So art becomes very experimental, very radical. We see a lot of expressive qualities, spiritual, subconscious. It's different for different isms, but there's a lot more play with what art is. Artists are really exploring more independently what their own feeling is about art or about the world. And then even artists begin to question what is art. So that becomes a huge question that we look at. In this video, we're also going to talk about 20th century architecture, which starts off, I would say, not a complete rejection of naturalism and tradition from before, but kind of. And then it ends in postmodernism, which is very, very different and unique. So we'll get there. When we look at what's going on historically, now the salons are being replaced by something called the armory show. This was something that happened multiple different times. And basically the idea was that it was an art exhibit where anybody could exhibit. So really encouraging modernists to come and show their work. The funny thing is that even though it was allowed for everybody to exhibit, there were pieces that were so radical, so extreme that they were denied from it. So it becomes very controversial in that way. And also the audiences that would go to the armory show would have strong reactions to some of the works, maybe not really welcoming them because they were so modern or so experimental. We also see a rise of female artists at this time. Artists start to publish their own manifestos. Think like Polykleitos with the Doryphorus and his ideas about the canon. Artists start to artists that associate themselves with a movement or an ism, they start to publish these manifestos on what should be done in art. And then we also have World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression that all influence art and society. It's a very creative time. There's a lot of reactions that are coming out in artwork. And because so many people are moving from Europe, we have New York becoming the new capital of the art world. And then I just add in here abstraction. Abstraction, abstraction. There's a lot of playfulness. Think naturalism is out of the way, so now it's all about different ways to abstract. All right. Let's start off with Fauvism. This one is a work by Matisse. Matisse is an artist who really changed and shifted his ideas and his styles many, many times while being an artist. So even though Fauvism describes a lot of his pieces, you could put him into multiple categories. This is a movement inspired by post-impressionism, so think Starry Night, think Gauguin's work. Those pieces, Van Gogh's stuff, they were on display at the time in Paris, and so this was something that influenced the Fauves. And they were a group of mostly friends in France working. Oftentimes there are broad, flat areas with extreme contrast of colors. A lot of times the colors are jarring and they kind of catch you off guard. And they're using color not in a realistic way, but more for emotional expression. All right, speaking of expression, we have Expressionism next, and we're splitting it into two categories. Most Expressionists were German, and there were these two categories, the Blue Rider and the Bridge. The Blue Rider was really a group of German artists that wanted to focus more on pure abstraction. There might be some symbols in it, but it was really beyond representation, more intellectual, and Kandinsky's work is a great example of that. There might be some things you recognize. You might recognize a boat, some waves, landscape elements, but really it's very intellectual. Music was a big influence, and so that was one style of Expressionism that we see. The second one, the bridge, they literally called themselves the bridge because they thought they were a bridge between traditional art forms and modern painting. So there's more naturalism in the way that we see symbols, we see representation, we can understand what's going on more, but they start to play with modernist techniques. Woodcuts were big. There were a lot of blunt forms, things that are jarring to look at, and war really impacted the subjects behind the work of artists in the bridge group, and there was a lot of emotion. Both groups, very emotional. Forms and outlines are distorted, so not looking at anything that's realistic or naturalistic. We see a lot of agitation, rough brush strokes, quick moving, and they were influenced by the color use of Fauvists. All right, so we looked at a work by the Blue Rider group, Kandinsky. Now let's look at the bridge. These are two members of this bridge group. Both of them, you see a lot of emotion in the pieces, but you can see where it's more representational. We can understand that there's a soldier figure here and then a nude figure behind. We understand that there's a death here and people are mourning and leaning over the grave. But both are done in this very emotional style. There's distortion, and themes of alienation were really common too. Remember, there's this reaction to the wars that are going on that people are feeling, and then it's coming out in their artwork in Expressionism. All right, moving on, we're going to look at Cubism next. I put Paul Cézanne's work here, even though he's a post-impressionist, he was earlier on. It's still important to put him with Cubists because he was one of the main influences for the two creators of Cubism, Braque and Picasso. He started to look at landscape and look at form from different angles, and so there's a lot of Cubist beginnings in the work of Cézanne, so I think it's important to talk about there. A big thing when we're talking about Cubism is we see multiple shifting viewpoints. So you might have one object depicted, but seeing it from multiple sides. A lot of times, Cubists would use simple subjects that were common, like still life. So for instance, here, it's actually not still life in this piece. I think it's a person with an instrument. But a lot of times, Cubist works, they would just use very simple things like portraiture or still life, and then they would distort it using this multiple shifting viewpoints kind of style. The works would be both 3D and flattened, so it kind of plays with your understanding of what two-dimensional art should be. The Kiss by Brancusi, this is a Cubist form. We see a lot of simplification. Because it's sculpture, it definitely looks different than the paintings that we see. And then Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is a really important piece. This is one of those pieces that was actually rejected from the Armory show, really seen as terrible by a lot of people who would go to the show. But ultimately, it's something that has become a really famous piece because it's so different and diverse. We have a lot of nude women. We also see this piece can sometimes be called primitivist. So that's another ism, primitivism. Basically, at the time, we're seeing a lot of museums open up with a lot of cultural things from non-Western cultures. So for instance, African masks were really, really influential. You even see some things that look like masks depicted here as well. And so artists would take those non-Western objects and styles and then incorporate them into their own artwork to kind of add this primitive element. Really, it's just taking and using it in a new way. So with Cubism, we do see a lot of angular edges. There are multiple different styles within Cubism, but that's kind of a broad overarching start. All right, Dadaism, one of my favorites. The Fountain, obviously a very important classic piece. This was a piece that was rejected from the Armory show as well, just way too controversial. This style developed in World War I. So there were a lot of emotions, a lot of destruction going on. And so artists in this Dada style were kind of believing that ideas and beliefs were all destroyed by war. War just took apart everything. And so this was a style that was very liberating and also destructive in a way to create art. So all of a sudden, by throwing this urinal in a different way, it's destroying our ideas of art, and it's also freeing because really anything can be art. You have so much power. The term Dada, it literally means hobby horse, so it's just nonsense. There's a real playfulness with Dadaism, and it's just the ultimate rejection of everything artistic that came before. It's also the start of the ready-made, basically taking things and that aren't really considered art and putting them on a pedestal, and then they become art. All right, and Dadaism fed right into surrealism, so that was kind of a direct reaction, just taking it a step further. And when we look at Merritt Oppenheim's work, this is a great example of that, because it's taking that ready-made and adding a little bit more of an emotional or a visceral reaction to it. If you can imagine drinking tea with this, there would be a feeling from this fur that kind of catches you off guard, and it's a little bit jarring. So it makes a good example of a surrealist work. Just to go over a little bit about all surrealism, a lot of times the dreams are influential in the themes. Subconscious thought is also a big part. And then a lot of times the goal for surrealists was to puzzle, to challenge, to fascinate, basically to stretch the mind and the intellect of the person viewing it. Sometimes the pieces were very irrational too. So the object is a great example of that irrational nature. It's not like you could go out and use this. It's just supposed to challenge and fascinate you. Now, Frida Kahlo, she actually rejected that she was a surrealist. A lot of people referred to her as a surrealist, but she felt she was portraying her truth, her narrative about her life. She worked in self-portrait, and so for her, it wasn't that she was doing anything irrational or dream-based. It was more that she was telling her story in a symbolic way. However, even though she rejected the term surrealist as what we kind of know her as, she's also a feminist, one of the early people that we look at for female empowerment, especially in the arts. And then the last one we have is The Jungle. Now this piece has both narrative related to Wilfredo Lamb's home country and experience, but it also has this kind of subconscious feeling behind it. So he had a lot of influences. There were African masks, the history of slavery in Cuba, and so there's a lot of story behind this, but it also has this really psychic state because of the colors, because of the repetitive forms. So it's taking this idea and kind of challenging you with it, making you really think and look hard as you continue to look. All right, constructivism. This is a term that was adopted by a lot of Western European artists, but mainly it was used by Russians. When we talk about constructivist architecture, even though we don't have a piece there, we're talking about art that is, or architecture that's devoid of historical references. They really wanted to break away from that. But when we're talking about it for all art, we're thinking of works that are constructed. So they're organized in a specific way. There are these separate components that are put together, which makes this photo montage make a lot of sense. So there's all of these constructed separate elements, but when they come together in this collage, you have one specific story. So yeah, with constructivism, it lacks a lot of decoration, but it is organized in the way that the composition is built. It's influenced by Cubism and Futurism, and this piece also has a lot of political history with the Soviet 5-year plan. So they're using elements that kind of bring you back to the subject at large. All right, next up, we have de stijl. Very fun to say. Literally means the style in Dutch. Mondrian is the main artist that we know that would be de stijl. And use of primary colors, lots of geometry. Really, he wanted to focus on having this universal language so everybody could look at a picture and feel or think the same thing, instead of, depending on your background, you might think or feel different things. So really just trying to make a universal feeling in art. Complete distraction or abstraction, not referencing any representation in the work. All right, the Harlem Renaissance. So a little historical context here. In the early 20th century, we have a lot of African Americans moving from the South, rural areas, to the North, moving to New York City because they're told that there's a lot more promise, they'll be treated better, and there'll be more job opportunities. So Harlem becomes this center for a lot of African Americans who move north, and it becomes this deep cultural area where arts are really prolific, and we're talking music, we're talking poetry, literature, painting, arts, everything becomes really prevalent in this one cultural center. A lot of the themes during the Harlem Renaissance are racial pride, civil rights, and influence of slavery on modern culture. There was this belief when African Americans would move north that things would be very different for them. And then they come to find out that a lot of times things were not different. There was still a lot of segregation, a lot of mistreatment of African Americans. And so a lot of artists used that as an influence in their work. And Lawrence is no exception. He made all of these panels that really talk about the experience of the African American in a really simplistic way that really highlights the main story, the main narrative as you go through. All right, moving on. The Mexican Muralists. So we have one that we look at, Rivera, but there were many at the time. In Mexico, fresco was really, really popular. It was something that a lot of people were very familiar with, including Diego Rivera. And a little side note, I'm pretty sure you went over this, but Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera were married. Little side note. So this is very political. It's all about social change. There's messages. It's art for the people. So this would have been on the side of a building so that people could see it, and people would look at the figures in here and they would be able to recognize who they were. So there are a lot of famous people depicted in this one mural. The themes of most murals by Mexican artists at the time were about labor struggles, working class issues, and then history too. So something that could be understood and the common person could really relate to. This specific piece has three different kind of areas. It talks about the conquest and the colonization of the Mexican region. It talks about dictatorship, and then it talks about revolution. So all of which, there are a lot of these dark undertones, but then it's put together in this way where there's this brightness, there's this, it almost seems like a celebration and a parade. So it's both getting you to think about the darker side, but also to celebrate the cultural beginnings of Mexico. And then also, I would say this is a great example of the concept we talked about before, horror vacui. If you think about it, there are no empty spaces here. It's so overwhelming. It would be a lot to take in. So it's something where you can keep going back and looking to kind of feel and read the image. All right, abstract expressionism. This is an interesting piece to me for abstract expressionism because most abstract expressionism doesn't really have much representation. In this one, we do have a woman that we can see. Obviously, she's very abstracted and it's very expressive. However, in this piece, they chose to have one with some representation. So one of the commonalities with abstract expressionism is you're seeing the artist's hand in their work, lots of rough brush strokes. A lot of times it was done with action painting where paint would be thrown at the canvas, or pieces would be worked on over and over and over again. So for instance, this piece has layer upon layer upon layer that were built up in this very aggressive and fast way. Abstract expressionisms were really going against artists like Mondrian that were so minimalistic. They wanted to take art in this much more emotion-filled direction, so people would have reactions to it, versus Mondrian, who wanted it to just be simple and be able to be viewed similarly by every person. So Willem de Kooning actually did, Willem de Kooning, my apologies, he had a ton of these portraits of women. His subject, he really wanted it to be about women in advertising, kind of the exploitation of women. And so that's why we have this little pasted on smile, these large oversized breasts, and this really aggressive approach to the female form. It also is kind of talking about the tradition of the nude, the female nude in the past, and how we put them on display. So this should kind of make you have a reaction when you look at it. That was a big part of his creation. And the abstract expressionists, they were developed following World War II. So that also leads into the aggression and the reactions, the really tense time that influenced the way that they created art. All right, color field painting. We have The Bay by Helen Frankenthaler. A lot of times it was flat without brush strokes. So even though there's, it's very similarly abstract and maybe expressive like the last works, in this case it's a lot more calm, We're seeing pouring paint on the canvas. She would pour this blue paint on top while it was wet. Soft organic edges, very subtle colors. This is abstraction, but maybe less expression. There's a little bit of feeling, but it's nowhere near as intense as what we saw with abstract expressionism. All right, pop art. Oldenburg is a great example of a pop art sculptor. And then we have, of course, Andy Warhol's piece here, the Maryland Diptych. So pop art was really influenced by pop culture. Specifically advertising, consumerism. It's a time when you can get a lot of products. People that are really famous become these objects which we can consume, and Marilyn Monroe is a great example of that. Elvis Presley is another one. They're just these superstars that become bigger than their own person through the media. So another big thing with pop art is there's no line between high art and mass-produced items. So for instance, we have, for Andy Warhol's piece here, we have this repetitive image of Marilyn over and over and over again. Part of it represents when she was alive with all of the really fake colors that kind of show that she is this symbol, this person that we put on a pedestal, so she's not even human anymore. And then the black and white side kind of showing her death, showing the destruction of who she was. So there's this kind of artificial feeling to it. The cult of the celebrity was a big part of pop art. People would really become so obsessed with a celebrity that they would faint when they would go out and see the person. It also denies the uniqueness of art. So a lot of high art previously was this one object which was really well appreciated, but now we're looking at mass production and incorporating that into what we consider high art. And Andy Warhol is a great example of that. A lot of his works he had factories working on, so he didn't even necessarily have his hand involved in it. When we look at Oldenburg's work, remember this was a very political work. He, for pop art, is a little bit interesting to me, but if you look at his other sculptures, because this was his first monumental sculpture, his other ones you've probably seen in cities, they're all these like basic material objects that are just of massive scale, and you'll just turn a corner in New York City and you'll see one of his pieces. But this piece specifically, remember it was done in secret, it was political, very anti-war, and it's got some feminine and some masculine symbolism in it as well. So this was one of his early works, but it's a really important one because it kind of starts off his tradition, and it also made the Yale campus kind of this political center that was very anti-war. All right, happenings and site-specific art. So Smithson, the spiral jetty. Remember, this is an earthwork. This is something that was formed using the stone that was there and made into a jetty, which is basically just a pier, but this case has a spiral, still exists to this day. And then if we talk about happenings, Kusama is one of the she births this idea of the happening. So she was not invited to participate in the Venice Biennial, which was a very famous art show. So outside in the fountain out front, she brought her own art piece and put all of these narcissus balls, these very reflective balls in the pool. And one of the things that is common about happenings is there's spontaneous elements. A lot of times there's crowd participation. So in this case, she was selling these balls for a few dollars in this narcissistic way. So you could just look in it and stare at yourself. So really one of the mothers of this movement, really interesting lady. All right, let's talk about architecture. So going back a little bit, this is one of our early skyscrapers. This is in Chicago. And this would be at the end of the 19th century. We're using iron, steel, glass, and terracotta. So buildings are starting to use materials that are a little more fire safe because they're seeing big buildings burn down in cities if they're not made of the right materials. This is an early skyscraper, not very tall to us nowadays, but this was very tall at its time. And it's one of the early pieces that has this skeleton that's really holding it together. So these interior bones that hold the building in a very strong way. At the time, people are moving into cities. There's a lot more going on in cities, so they have this need to build up instead of out. Buildings were having a lot of differing functions depending on the level. So this is a great example. Down at the bottom, there's a lot more large windows. And here's a floor plan of that bottom level, which would have been like a department store. And then there would be offices up above. So the style would change depending on the function. And then also the elevator being invented was a hugely important piece to this as well. The ornamentation you see here is down on that first level, just to kind of draw the crowd in to the store that would be down below. So that's an early skyscraper. We're going to talk about the international style, and then we'll look at an international style skyscraper that's later on. But first, it's important to talk about Le Corbusier. He believed homes should be a machine for living. So when you look at this, very much looks like a machine. Not a lot of ornamentation that we'd typically see on a home. Clean lines, white blank facades, and this was also the beginning of the use of ferroconcrete. So this was a way to make these large panels of windows and not have walls fall down. So it was an invention that was really important. All of the structure was space that was utilized. Furniture was built into it, so it was really streamlined, just like a machine would be. There wasn't a lot of decorative ornamentation. So that's the international style. And then it's also shown in this skyscraper, the Seagram building. If you look, it's just perfectly rectangular. There's not a lot of extra going on. We do see decorative elements that are vertical and horizontal, so just really highlighting the crispness of the shape. And we do see some new materials. The use of bronze on this exterior was really kind of new and innovative. And the architects were really thinking less is more to make their building really beautiful. Very simple, very geometric, which kind of goes along with that idea of the international style. All right, then a different style that we have to look at is the Prairie style. And the most famous Prairie style architect was Frank Lloyd Wright. There's a ground plan here that you can look at, and then we have some pictures of the actual house. The Prairie style was all about rejecting historical styles of buildings and doing something different. In this case, it was really important for them to be in harmony with the site. So this site was over a river and a waterfall, and so they wanted the building to kind of feel connected to that site. So we see materials that connect it. We also see shapes that connect it that are repeated, and then the fact that it's built over the waterfall, and that's that cantilever construction that we've talked about. So you can see that there are all these forms that project out. They don't actually have like basements or supports underneath, and the cantilever really made that possible. This was a new architectural invention as well. It's much less box-like, so unlike the international style, we're seeing a lot more playfulness with the form, and then just once again really connected to nature. And so the styles we're looking at, there are many more architectural styles, but these are just a few of the more important ones that we highlight in our curriculum. All right, last one, postmodernism. I don't know why it won't come up. There we go. So now we're seeing use of historical elements brought back. Prairie style, they didn't want to use any historical elements, but with postmodernism, it's all about taking things from the past and playing with them in really new and innovative ways, sometimes in ways that maybe we look at and think are extremely odd. So this is a house in Delaware. You probably see some things that look representational of things that we know. We see things that look like columns, but they're really flattened, just really, really flat shapes, and they also seem very stretched out. We also see different architectural elements. We see a curved window, behind it there are square windows, we see triangular behind the curve, and so they're taking all of these things, putting them together in very, very new ways. This artist really Venturi thought that less was a bore. So the international style was so boring, not a lot going on. Instead, he wanted to take things and have fun and put them together in non-traditional ways. So there's a lot of ornamentation, a lot of traditional elements, but just reimagined in a very modernist way, which is a great place to end for our 20th century isms. All right, I hope this helps you guys review. Think about, with continuity and change, how the different wars are impacting all of the artists at the time, and then how the different styles play off of one another, because there's not as much jumping from one style to the next style to the next style. Now artists are going in lots of different directions. So think about why that might be happening. And good luck with your studying.